Okay, welcome everybody to today's Humanities Research Centre seminar. It's my pleasure to welcome Associate Professor Paul Watt, who'll be speaking to us this afternoon. Let me begin, as we always do in the HRC, by acknowledging the first Australians on whose traditional lands the HRC is established, and from where I'm speaking to you here in Canberra, and acknowledge the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. We're joined today by Paul Watt, who is unfortunately more virtual than we would like to be the case, a virtual visiting fellow, I suppose you might say, of the HRC in this current semester. And Paul joins us from Melbourne, but via the Elder Conservatorium of Music at the University of Adelaide. Although in these pandemic times, who is anywhere? Who even? Paul could be next door to me, and I would have no idea, to be honest. But he joins us from the University of Adelaide, and Paul is the author of two books: Ernest Newman, A Critical Biography, and The Regulation and Reform of Music the Regulation and Reform of Music Criticism in 19th Century England. He's also the co-editor of several books, including the Oxford Handbook of Music and Intellectual Culture in the 19th Century. He's at the HRC working on a number of different book projects, including Music, Morality and Social Reform in the 19th Century, Regimes of Health and Hygiene for Singers in the 19th century, which has a sort of contemporary COVID sort of feel to it. And today, he's going to be asking the question, who's afraid of Sigmund Freud? Musicological responses to psychobiography. Now, as I said to some of you who logged in earlier, we're set up as a Zoom webinar right now. So unfortunately, we can't really see each other, but I'm going to ask you to use the chat function, which you'll see down the bottom of your screen, or the Q&A function to provide Paul with questions that I can read out at the end of the session here. So Paul's going to talk for about sort of 40 minutes or so, and we're going to have 15 minutes or so for questions. So Paul, welcome. I'd like to invite you to share your PowerPoint screen with us as you ask us, who is afraid of Sigmund Freud?
Thanks very much, Ibrahim. It's good to be there and good to be here. The PowerPoint is just opening up as I guess you can see that okay. Great, thanks very much. Well, thanks everyone for turning up at what is this kind of exhausting day of lockdown. If you're in the three states and territories, where things are still a bit well, locked down. There's no other way around it, I guess. Before I start, I'd just like to thank Will Christie and the staff of the Centre for hosting my fellowship in the last couple of months. Most of the fellowship was actually spent in lockdown in Canberra, which had an upside. No, let's start with the downside. It had a downside and an upside. The downside was that I didn't get to the National Library as much as I'd have hoped. And so the presentation today is a little bit conceptual and more broad than what I would normally give as a result. But the upside is that a fellowship in lockdown is perfect for slow reading and thinking. And I think those two ingredients are especially useful in a fellowship. And I'm very grateful to have had the time sponsored by the Centre to be able to do that. And I'm very grateful. I'll just make it a start here. So the key question is, who's afraid of Sigmund Freud? Musicological responses to psychobiography. And there are a few other questions that I'll address along the way. And the first instance, well, why would someone embark on a project like this? And there's basically one principal answer is that musicology does not have a history of musical biography, whereas a lot of other disciplines, particularly English literature and English history, do. There's a vast literature on the history of biography, but this is missing in musicology. And to fill that gap, a history of psychoanalytic biography can work to fill that gap and provide some insight into the way that musicology has shaped itself from really the Enlightenment to the present time. There are only two reasonably detailed histories of the musical biography, which are shown there: Hans Lennenberg's Witnesses and Scholars, and an article by Jolanta Pekach from 2004. They're quite dated texts, neither of which spend a lot of time on psychoanalytic biography, certainly not in music. So this was the starting point. I've always loved reading biographies, and I've always been interested in psychobiography, and just so happened in the last few years, various strands of thought and different projects led me to finally start work on something I'd been, I guess, aspiring to start for quite some time. There are about 4 parts to my talk. They're all of different lengths. Some will be quick to get through, some will take a bit longer. But I have 2 principal questions that I wanted to start with, and they are: in what ways have writers, used psychoanalytic methods to account for the lives and careers of musicians? And the second one is, what can a history of musical psychobiography tell us about the history of musicology? And I'm going to hopefully answer these questions during this talk. For the moment, I'm largely excluding psychoanalytic studies of opera. There's a vast literature on the interpretation of opera through the psychoanalytic lens of various theorists, but I'm setting those aside for the moment while I concentrate more specifically on biography writing rather than opera analytics. So the context for this study is, at the moment, it's a history of Freudians, proto-Freudians, neo-Freudians, and pseudo-Freudians. That is, people who have largely based their biographical work on Freudian theories. Potentially this project can also look at the influence of other theorists like Lacan and Erikson, but for the moment, I'm sticking with Freud. The study stops at about 1980, and that's where Freud's impact perhaps seems to start to wither away in favour of scholars such as a re-interest in Anna Freud and Kathy Carew and other scholars. I want to begin this talk by saying I'm not a defender of Freudian psychoanalytic theory. I'm well aware of its monoculturalism. I'm well aware of the tools often used by men in the service of misogyny in particular. So it's a troublesome approach. It's a troublesome area of research. But it's ultimately a research topic of intellectual history. But it tends not to be developmental history, or the progress of analytic theory, or the development of or advances in. It tends to be an interrupted history, and it tends to be episodic in much the same way that a patient will present to a psychoanalyst in an episodic kind of way. That's about the best analogy I can give. I wouldn't set out to provide a narrative of progress in development of something which changes over time, but in different ways. And I'm going to talk about the way that those lines of inquiry and influence have worked in some cases. I'm going to briefly talk about the scholarly study of music and some conventions in musical biography for those not familiar with musicological work generally. And a warning that this is very, very general, but it's a start for an overview. So musicology is predominantly the discipline in which musical lives and works are studied and analysed. There are journalists and writers from many other backgrounds and disciplines that write about music, but musicology is sort of the home where most of this happens. Musicology, like most humanities disciplines, was formed in the 19th century, mainly in French, German and English-speaking countries. And it was inherently an interdisciplinary undertaking right from the start. So scholars in ethnography and jurisprudence, acoustics, psychology, comparative history, together established a discipline that right from the start was what we would label today as interdisciplinary. It was also factional, surprise, surprise, but it never pursued one singular line of inquiry. Musical biography, in all of that, is one of its many subdisciplines, and there are many taxonomic charts of the discipline from the 19th century right up to the present that position musicology in various levels of hierarchies. Some have it as an important subdiscipline, others have it right at the bottom as unimportant. And musical biography sometimes suffers from a reputation of not being particularly scholarly and lacking insight. And I think in those cases, it's simply the life and times of so-and-so is not a particularly interesting genre to read, often not particularly scholarly as well. And there's a hint that kind of writing is not for the academy. And that's why musical biography in some instances has this kind of reputation of not being as scholarly as other parts of musicological endeavour. There are some conventions around musical biography that I'm sure are fairly certain in any other discipline, that it generally focuses on heroic men doing heroic things, that the biography is a statue or a monument to greatness. A particular anomaly with musical biography is the separation of life and work narratives, which has been a mainstay in musical biography for a very long time. A principal example of this is the Master Musician series that was inaugurated by Oxford University Press, that is still still published today, in which exactly the first half of the book is the life and times narrative, and the second half of the book is a detailed structural analysis of the musical works. Now, the analysis can take many shapes and forms, but even today, the Oxford University Press still mandate the separation of life and works. There is a biography of Vaughan Williams coming out next year that subverts this pattern for the first time. And I'm not going to give a spoiler alert, but it makes a significant departure from that series. Of course, psychoanalytic biography, in some respects, does a good job of combining life and work and enabling the reader to get a more holistic, I suppose, and less compartmentalised understanding and to derive meaning from the musical work when life and work are not so separated. The following slides are not going to be new news to those of you who work in European history or English literature, particularly 20th century literature, but I'm going to outline three major, I suppose, episodes, to use that word again, in the development of psychobiography, but also music biography. And the two game changers were Freud's Leonardo da Vinci from 1910 and Strecky's Eminent Victorians from 1918. And I'm sure many of you have read these books. Freud's Leonardo da Vinci is essentially a detailed study of the Oedipal complex in Da Vinci as a part explanation for his homosexuality. Whereas Strecky's Eminent Victorians is arguably not a Freudian psychoanalytic study of his subjects, but rather a debunking of the heroic. And it's between these years, and certainly in the 1930s, as we'll soon see, that the idea of a psychoanalytic biography and a debunking biography coalesced and resulted in some very terrible works of biography. I'm going to talk through some of those and again come back to that at the end to give a sense of where things went during these years. Some of you may have read some biographies not realising that they were psychobiographies. And there's a few examples here from Religion, Politics and Music. These are just a tiny sample of a huge corpus. We see in the case of Religion that Albert Schweitzer wrote a psychoanalytic biography of Jesus. He also wrote one on Bach, which we're going to look at shortly. Erickson's work on Luther has been a significant influence on a couple of later studies of Bach and Protestantism. Work on Hitler and Woodrow Wilson, particularly the Woodrow Wilson biography, are seen as high watermarks. And Maynard Solomon's work on Beethoven is generally regarded to be one of the most significant psychoanalytic biographies in musicology. Ernest Newman's work on Liszt is considered one of the least successful, and I'm going to talk about the Liszt volume shortly. I've given some timelines here to try and help to understand the factional element in all of this. From the 1930s to the 2000s, scholars hedged their bets. There's a huge number of articles and books that tried to be the definitive account of the new biography or the new history. Writers including Peter Gay and Gertrude Himmelfarb, for example, attempted more than once to state their claim, to write the definitive write the definitive article about the gap between old and new. If we were cynical, perhaps we could say they were going for higher Google citations. But there's probably 20 or 30 books and articles that kept promising that this was the beginning of a new era, and it went on for 70 years. 2009, I think, is the most recent book that purports to, at last, here is a new era, we should all get with the program, but it has come rather late in the day. Probably the most controversial piece of literature written to support a psychoanalytic biography, in particular Freudian psychoanalytic theory, was William Langer's article there from American Historical Review, 1958. It was an expanded version of a keynote address he gave to the American Historical Society about the need for historians to essentially move the Titanic. He had quite disrespectful things to say about the usual ways in which a historian works, and argued that Freudian psychoanalytic theory in particular needed to become part and parcel of historical work into the future. And it's no exaggeration to say that all hell did break loose. There was a tremendous backlash for years and years over this particular article. It generated turf warfare. So in the 70s and 80s, we have Bazin, Stannard, and Gay writing books to claim their point of view. Bazin's Clear on the Doctors is, like much of Bazin's work, angry, very upset, and refuses to accept any of Freud's theories. He had earlier written a fantastic critique of the Leonardo piece, in fact, that was very credible. But Bazin was incandescent with rage, and I've written about this in another article previously about his tirade against any kind of psychological import in historical writing. David Stannard in 1980 was very blunt and said basically that historians have to put the end to psychohistory. That psychohistory really needs to grind to a halt. And in fact, he set out to prove that over the last 20 years, it had gone nowhere, or it had gone down avenues that were not respectable and were not true accounts of history. It's also a pretty angry book. Peter Gay's Freud for Historians is a much more measured account. Gay, as most of you will know, did train as a psychoanalytic therapist. Whether he practiced or not, I'm not sure. But Gay's book was a much more reasonable attempt to find a smoother course between the spitefulness of Bazin and the anger of Stannard. And Gay's work is critical in the sense that it's balanced. It gives a much more rational account of how psychohistory and psychobiography can in fact be very useful tools for the historian. In this next part, I'm going to talk through some examples of some psychobiographical writing that I've been looking at. And I want to make the point that a psychobiography doesn't have to be a book. It doesn't have to be a 270-page book. I'm also looking at, I suppose, long articles or essays. I don't have a rule of thumb for a cutoff, but anything that's about 10 pages, regardless of font size or mode of typesetting, I'm quite happy to consider that as a psychobiography, because we see psychobiographies embedded in larger works that aren't psychobiographical in nature, particularly in the example of J.S. Bach that we'll get to in just a sec. So here I have a running list of all the composers, performers, and writers of or about music that I have identified as having some connection to psychoanalytic theory. Whether it's Freud, it doesn't matter, there is always some connection. So I don't know how well this is coming up on the screen, but the dark blue people, so Gustav Mahler, Larry Adler, Glenn Gould, and Max Graf, were all patients of Freud. No, they weren't. Patients of Freud or patients of Freud's legacy, so people who'd studied with Freud. So they'd actually had Freudian psychoanalysis with people who'd trained with Freud, if that makes sense. Debussy and Schoenberg, there is some evidence to suggest that they also had treatment in psychoanalysis, but I'm yet to nut that out. And I'm sure that this is not a complete list. What I should have said is that the composers here, there are significant psychoanalytic studies on each of these composers from about the early 20th century to the present. Larry Adler himself has written about his experience of psychoanalysis, and I've got a book chapter coming out in the Cambridge History of Atheism that discusses that. And I've recently read a little bit about Glenn Gould's experience of psychoanalysis, though there's not much to go on because the case notes don't survive. And the biographer in question just simply assumes that he had therapy because of unresolved issues with his mother and manifestations of the Oedipal complex. Max Graf will be known to many of you who he actually did a terrible thing and psychoanalyzed his own son, which of course wouldn't happen now. And little Max was also psychoanalyzed by Freud. And little Max, as the case study is known, has become quite a signature case on early childhood psychiatry, which is still referred to in literature today by professional psychiatrists as a significant turning point in the treatment of children. This list, I expect, will grow. This is really just what I've got so far. Of course, there are Freudian themes in lots of biographies, ranging from obsession, the uncanny, condensation, hysteria, the Oedipal complex, repression, interpretation of dreams, and the death instinct. I'm not going to talk through all of those. These are just some of the broader Freudian schemes that we see in a lot of the writing. Hysteria often associated with women. I'm going to talk about the theory of condensation in Beethoven. And there are a few studies on the uncanny and repression. Some writers have invoked the pleasure principle and degeneration as Freudian concepts in their work on psychobiography. But these things are old, they're not Freudian. Freudian did write a lot on the pleasure principle and to a lesser extent on degeneration, but these of course were ideas from the late Enlightenment, certainly the pleasure principle. And degeneration, of course, in writers such as Nietzsche. So the problem of this kind of research often is trying to weed out what is Freudian and what is not. And sometimes that's very complicated. But certainly the pleasure principle has fed an entirely separate line of psychological inquiry, which I'm not going into today, and also themes of degeneration that many of you have probably written about. I'm going now to describe as best I can some of the approaches taken in a handful of psychobiographies that I've been reading. And the first is Albert Schweitzer's biography of Bach. It's a 2-volume thing. This is not a linear or historical narrative biography. It's actually simply a collection of essays on all sorts of stuff to do with Bach. And they're all thrown together in a not very systematic way. And it's only chapter 9 that deals with Bach. And Schweitzer's starting point, like many psychobiographers, they want to go looking for a disorder or a personality displacement. But unlike a lot of writers, Schweitzer was keen not to become obsessed by that, if I may use that word, he simply noted that Bach was a bit difficult to work with. And then through the use of historical documents such as letters and memoirs of other people, he was able to construct I suppose, a narrative of how Bach behaved in the court system. And you can see that I've just cherry-picked, which is a bit irresponsible, but I've just cherry-picked a few things that Schweitzer was able to say about Bach, about his personality, about the way he behaved in the workplace, about how he treated his students. And I think a lot of this writing, if you were to read it or I was to read it, we'd probably say it lent itself easily to a very general Freudian kind of analysis. And I know that's very vague, but it is clear that Schweitzer was very interested in psychoanalytic theory and the writings of Freud, but didn't go down the trap of immediately going for a character assassination. The next book I'm talking about is Ernest Newman's study of Liszt, which is probably one of the most unsuccessful musical biographies. I've actually written a lot on this. It was my favourite biography for a while for all the wrong reasons. But anyway, Newman set out the study to be a study of the soul divided against itself. And there's a literature around the history of psychobiography saying that, arguing that any study that starts with binaries in place or dualisms is going to get unstuck. It's going to sort of fall into a hole. And this is exactly what happened with this book. Newman prefaced the book with this very long, rambling introduction about his objective and scientific approach to biography. And he was following André Maurois' dictum on what a biography would be. And he was saying that he was not going to stand Liszt on trial or any of that kind of thing. But he did exactly the opposite. And he didn't help himself by not translating passages from French and German accurately. And these were picked up in the reviews. But Newman was riding the wave of Strecky mania, as were a lot of people of the period. I've seen the correspondence with the publishers at the University of Texas at Austin. And Newman needed to make a lot of money. Well, he didn't need to, he wanted to. And he thought that if he wrote this kind of biography in the Streckian mould, he would make an absolute mozza. But he didn't, because the book flopped. And the book flopped because he attacked a sacred cow, Franz Liszt. And Newman hated Christianity. And so Liszt never stood a chance with Newman at all. And you can see there some of these descriptors of Liszt as a charlatan, a womanizer, and a circus rider. These three words are peppered right throughout the book. He also claimed Liszt was a misogynist, which of course he was, and that Liszt was a user and a parasite and a dreadfully awful human being. This book just did not fly. It did not sell, and it plunged Newman into depression, actually, for quite a few years. And we almost didn't get Newman to finish his 4-volume Life of Wagner as a consequence. Max Graf's work on Beethoven, I'm still working through. It's extraordinarily complex, deeply fascinating. As I mentioned before, Graf was friends with Freud, and little Max was analysed by both Freud and Graf. And this book by Graf, which is actually about Shostakovich and Beethoven, is a study of Beethoven's subconscious. And many of you will know from your reading that so many writers get confused with the unconscious or the subconscious, or they conflate them. They don't see them as separate things, or they do see them as part and parcel of the same thing. But the use of the subconscious was telling. Essentially, Graf argues that Beethoven recycled the same material across various different works, and that's representative of Freud's theory of condensation. And I think this runs into trouble because musicologists will know that composers always recycle stuff. Does it mean that it is a psychiatric or psychological abnormality or feature? I don't think it does. Bach and Handel self-borrowed heaps. Interestingly, Ernest Newman wrote a book called The Unconscious Beethoven, in which he argued that Beethoven's musical language could be could be reduced to a number of cells. And for the musicologists in the room, it was kind of like a watered down Schenker thing. That book also didn't sell, but actually there's been some work recently on the history of music analysis, and Newman's fingerprint theory is coming back into vogue. But for the time being, Max Graf's book, on Beethoven, I think is extraordinarily good, and is probably one of the best books I've read so far. And I'm going to come back to Beethoven a little bit later. And I think this book is successful because Graf knows the theory inside out, and he can apply it intelligently, and he avoids what other writers call psychobabble, which is just a conjuring of Freudian terminology thrown together like a word salad. Graf knows his stuff, and he writes very well. And well, to my mind, it's also very convincing, except for his theory of condensation, which I think is a little off the mark. I wasn't going to show you this slide, and I'll tell you why when I've finished talking about it. Cardis was a music critic in London, and later came to Sydney to cover the Test cricket. He was also a cricket reporter. He was a self-styled rationalist and atheist. He had a very imperfect understanding of what a rationalist and atheist was. And in his language around his spirituality, he simply just described himself as being spiritual, which I think was a bit of a cop-out, really. He was essentially a Christian and a submarine Catholic, although I dread to use the word submarine at the moment. But he goes to church at Easter and Christmas, and that's about it. But this is just a small essay on Schnabel that I want to interrogate just for a moment. I don't know where it fits in the project as a whole just yet, but I want to read you this nonetheless. And it's before going onto the platform for a public performance. I would call to mind what Schnabel used to say to his students when they were nervous about playing in front of the audience. You will only be nervous when you go to the piano and you're thinking about yourself. Think of Beethoven, and then he will play. Schnabel wanted the pianist to be a medium, so far as a human being can be. Whenever I heard Schnabel play, I felt he was a medium, through whom music was speaking. There are very few pianists today whom I would put in that category. I wasn't going to include this slide because I just thought it was anti-intellectual and silly. But I have included it because I gave a presentation to the Australian Association Group of Psychotherapists a few months ago. And this slide created the most discussion and questions in the question time afterwards. And some in the audience, some of the psychiatrists in the audience pointed out that, in fact, a not insignificant number of their patients do experience aspects of being a conduit through which famous artists and musicians speak to them. And I had downplayed this as all a bit silly. And they reminded me that it's not silly, that actually we can't discount the existence of an alternative or parallel consciousness, and that to do so actually minimises some of the experiences of their patients. And there was one psychiatrist in particular who said that she felt that she was a channel or a conduit to Sibelius. So I've put this in here, not really knowing where it fits yet, but is an example possibly of psychobabble. That could be disingenuous, it could be unfair, but it will find a place as the research gets going and I get closer to being able to pull the various threads together. And the final example I want to share is a recent essay by Phil Hebelthwaite regarding Anya Thauer, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Thauer was born in 1945 and she died by suicide in 1973. And she was dubbed the Germaine de Pré after the famous British cellist Jacqueline de Pré, who died in the 80s, early 90s. Sorry, 87 I have there. It's gone from my head. Multiple sclerosis, I believe. And in this article, Hebelthwaite describes both Dupre's life and Thou's life as being of myth, mystery, and greatness. And their untimely deaths, of course, give grist to the mill for a psychoanalytic study. Or any kind of study. It's fascinating, particularly when Anja's lover killed himself less than a week after she did. He was also her treating physician. So there's a story there. It's intriguing. There is a biography of Thou being written at the moment. I can't remember by whom. But Hebelthwaite's argument I want to talk about, because he argued that, well, there was so little information about her that he found himself searching for clues to her personality in her playing. I didn't hear introspection of any kind, or any kind of macabre foresight of her own fate. That's really bad history, and that's really bad writing in my view. And there's tons of this kind of writing in musical biography. It's a projection of the biographer onto the subject. And in this case, I think it's particularly unsettling because it is a male writer trying to discern a problem in a female performer. And I think on so many levels, it's creepy, which is not a very intellectual thing for me to say, but I also think it's quite misguided. There are some serious musicologists who do believe that an analysis of someone playing an instrument or a particular interpretation can lend itself to a psychological interpretation. I manifestly disagree with that. I don't think it's possible. I think it's projection, and I think it's not a good way of. It's not good journalism, and I don't think it's particularly good history. Sorry, I'm getting problems with my buttons going up and down. So in the final part, I'm going to reflect on what are some of the problems of psychobiography in music in general, and some of the challenges that are apparent. Bach's work on Schweitzer is possibly preoccupied with personality traits. Ernest Newman's preoccupied with character assassination. Graf is preoccupied with Freud. Cardis is preoccupied with metaphysics. I don't think metaphysics is quite the right word here. And we have Phil Hebelthwaite a little preoccupied with mystery, intrigued, and in search of a racy read. I'm going to come back to the idea of a preoccupation or an obsession in a moment. The problems here are not new. They've been identified by all sorts of biographers writing all sorts of topics. That inherent problem of psychobiography, some says you can't analyse the dead. Erickson, I think, is incorrect. He did of Luther, and I do think if you've got the right documents and the right evidence, whatever that is, it is possible to psychoanalyse the dead. I do think that's possible. Freudian psychoanalytic theory in general is sometimes completely discarded by scholars as being bunk and racist and sexist and all those things, and I accept that. There are other arguments that have worked against psychobiography, in that some writers can't get beyond religion and seeing the composer particularly as a conduit of redemption through music and of the restorative nature of music, and that somehow he or she is divinely inspired. And there's one exception to this narrative, which is a fantastic book on the Mozart operas. And I said I wasn't going to talk about opera, but I'm going to just for now, by Bridget Brophy from the 40s, that really pushes back against this idea that the meaning of an artwork and the narrative of a composer's lives begins and ends with their religiosity or their spirituality or the connection to a deity. And she argues that psychoanalytic methods, Freudian or otherwise, is the next step, and that musicologists have not taken that step but need to. They need to get beyond, I guess, the transcendent, the metaphysical. And of course, we have problems of projection, causation, and correlation that plague all sorts of historical writing, not just biography, and certainly not only psychobiography. I think there are a few challenges of psychobiography in music, and I've covered these already, essentially. First is that we need to move away from these romantic narratives from the 19th century of a hero who can do no wrong, and the narrative religion and metaphysics. And Bridget Brophy's book is just brilliant for really giving a compelling, really compelling account of how this is possible and why it should be done. Psychobiography can cherry pick its evidence, it can cherry pick what it says. You know, Newman did a terrible critique of Liszt, but left out the bits that Liszt was emotionally and psychologically abusive to his wife and children. There's only a little bit of work recently that's explored this in detail. I mean, Liszt banned his children from seeing their mother for years when they were children. So what's going on with Liszt's personality or environment that makes him do that? It is possible to write a psychobiography in a way that that Newman did, but you miss stuff out. I think I've read every biography of every member of the Wagner family, and there's a wonderful opportunity here to explore the personality disorders that plagued that family for generations. There's recently one of the most recent psycho-ish biographies is of Cosima Wagner. But it's just absolutely fantastic to weave these threads of intergenerational acquisition is not the right word, of behaviours that afflict still, arguably, members of the troubled Wagner family. And the last point about this is that there will be people who disagree with me on this, but I don't believe that a musical score represents an illness or a diagnosis, unless there is evidence to suggest otherwise. And here we have simply the opening bars of Beethoven's Symphony No. 5. Da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum. And for generations, these, 1 to 4, 5 bars of music were interpreted as a religious motif, that Beethoven was knocking on heaven's door, that it might also represent his delinquent relationship with his nephew, that it might be a metaphor or a simile or a representation of the anger he had towards his publishers. He was not the most cooperative of clients with his publishers. But other research has suggested that it's a transcription of a bird call. We don't know. And I think historically, certainly not presently, but historically, I think writers on music have too easily gone for easy interpretations of what they think a score means. There's also the problem of the starting point of trying to create a negative stereotype or to character assassinate someone, and the way you do it is with psychoanalytic theory. I sat through a conference paper many years ago on Elgar. The argument in the paper was that Elgar hated women, or rather was afraid of women, and that meant he was gay. And also the evidence used was that he always signed his letters to his male friends with love, or love from Ed or Edward or whatever it was. And this was not seeing wood for the trees, that whether Elgar loved or hated women, I'm not the expert, but the presenter also didn't know that it was habitual for British men in Edwardian England to sign their names love. I've done heaps of work on composers of this period. They all write letters and end it with love. Heterosexual, gay, bisexual, etc., etc. This is not a marker of sexuality. This is just a symptom of really bad armchair psychology that does constitute a fair amount of psychological writing in music, and presumably in lots of other domains as well. Many of you will know Judith Brett, who wrote an essay, I think, on Deacon. Could be wrong, but I want to quote Judith here because I think she sums up some of the issues I've been talking about really well. And she says, to admit to using psychoanalytic ideas in biographical work is immediately to find oneself on the defensive, facing a salvo of arguments ranging from Freud is bunk, as we saw before, to you can't psychoanalyze the dead. There have been some very bad books published under this description of psychoanalytic biography. I want to advance that psychoanalytic concepts and methods should be present in the biographer's toolkit. And I absolutely agree with this 100%. There's lots of bad books and essays on musical psychobiography. But the starting point for anyone starting out is Peter Gay's Freud for historians. And I think the best psychoanalytic biographies are biographies that use a variety of approaches, historical approaches, ethnographic approaches, Freudian approaches, and it becomes a more holistic study. Maynard Solomon's biography on Beethoven is regarded as a psychobiography, but there's very little psychoanalysis in it. But when it's used for a purpose, and it's used succinctly. The Freudian psychoanalysis does not become the tail that wags the dog. And I think that's a really important message for future biographers. But I also think the literature agrees, the critical literature agrees, that when Freudian psychoanalytic theory or psychoanalytic theory from anyone is used in a measured way, along with everything else, it can be a very compelling and successful piece of writing. So I'm going to come back to the questions I posed at the beginning. Who's afraid of Sigmund Freud? This is a bit of a downer, actually, because when I started this research project, I didn't have a clue that I was going to find so much stuff. So I was hoping the answer was going to be, well, everybody, because they haven't written psychobiographies, but there's a huge corpus out there. So I'm afraid, rather uneventfully, lots of writers on music are quite happy not to be afraid of Sigmund Freud. And in what ways have writers used psychoanalytic methods to account for the lives and careers of musicians? So they've been varied. They're many and varied. They're faithful and unfaithful to perhaps the hardcore theory. Some are quite specific, others are very broad. And what can a history of music psychobiography contribute to the history of musicology? And there are lots of stuff I could go into here, but there are just four that I'd like to discuss to end. That there are alternative narratives out there to explain genius, creation, and musical meaning, getting away from the score and getting away from projecting the biographer's intent onto the subject. It challenges stereotype views about music as redemptive, sacred, and inspired. Those of you that go to classical music concerts will probably read in program notes that what you're listening to is redemptive, sacred, and inspired in some way, shape, or form. These narratives still exist. And in the right hand, psychobiography is a successful blend of approaches. And I have a list here of people who I think have written brilliantly on psychobiography. And Susan McClary is the outlier here, because until recently, I'd never considered Susan McClary's work to be psychoanalytical, but I kind of guess it is in a way. But one of the marvelous, exciting things about a project like this is reading the most recent issue of the Journal of Psychiatry, where psychiatrists have just discovered the work of Susan McClary from the 90s. And beside themselves with excitement about her work on Beethoven, and with Beethoven's anniversary last year, this journal is now encompassing the work of Susan McClary rather late in the day, but better late than never, but just proves the point that work in this area is cyclic. It's not necessarily developmental, and it's episodic. It comes and goes. It has waves of interest. And finally, I preempted the end. Finally, if I just go right to the end. Sorry to inflict this on you. Still didn't work. It's just the list of a couple of things that I will scroll more slowly. It just lists a couple of publications I'm working on at the moment. The first is a chapter on psychobiography for an Oxford handbook. And the second project that I'd like to write is to look at some historical cases of how different writers have approached Freudian psychoanalytic theory in constructions of musical biography of Beethoven. A similar study has been done on Wagner many, many years ago. And I'd love to be able to demonstrate that psychobiographical methods can take many forms, come to very different conclusions, to reach different insights about the one composer and probably a handful of works. So that's what I've been up to in the last couple of months. And thanks for coming and thanks for listening.
And thank you, Paul. We have several questions already. Please use the Q&A functions or the chat functions. From Roger Hillman, he wants to know quickly if you're looking at biographies beyond the written, for example, film, and also whether there is a category of psycho-autobiography, Berlioz's memoirs, for example, or any composer's letters and diaries.
Hi, Roger. I bet there is. I don't know that I've knowingly come across any, or maybe I have and I've not realised what they are. But I suspect that there are. Certainly Berlioz's memoirs are in that category. But certainly something I need to keep an eye on, thank you. And do I accept bios beyond the written? Yes, but not at the moment. I'm keeping to the written books at the moment. And in fact, there's a film about Berlioz too, actually, that could be looked at. I don't think anyone's written on that, which ties back to your first question. And Hayden's question there.
Oh, yes. Are any of the mentioned psychobiographic preoccupations worse than others? How can musicologists be reflexive with these positions and assumptions?
That's
to rank psychobiographic sins.
Yeah. I mean, the old-fashioned historian, or maybe not so much the old-fashioned historian, but we're always preoccupied, aren't we? When whatever we work on, there's always a preoccupation that we have. There's always inherent biases and stuff. Sometimes you don't know it till stuff goes to peer review, and it's there, it's pointed out. I don't know that some preoccupations are worse than others. I think something I didn't go into in detail today, but something I've talked a lot about with Sally MacArthur is the use of Freudian psychoanalysis to demonise women. And I think that preoccupation is especially distasteful. So I'd say that's the top of the list for a bad preoccupation. And I think musicologists be reflexive with these positions and assumptions. Yeah, that's hard. I think the problem I have is try to put aside my own biases personally and try to be open to different ways of thinking. For example, I personally don't think it's possible that you can channel Schnabel from beyond the grave, but maybe I have to accept that that's my worldview and it could be wrong. So I think keeping an eye on blind spots actually is the message there, and to be aware of them.
We've got a few more questions that have just come in. Firstly, from Alistair Noble. Do you feel the music plays any part in such biography as source material? Recognizing that this can be terribly trivial, as you noted, I wonder, is there a place for the score or the sound?
Absolutely. And probably not the score so much as sketches. And I think, is it Friedman has done some work on this? And this is an area I'm yet to go into, but unless I'm wrong, Alistair, I think there's been recently a slight resurgence in the examination of sketch studies. So maybe not the score so much, unless there's an annotated score, or someone's memory of working with the composer as she or he put the score together. And in terms of sound, that's also very tricky. Because they can be very culturally specific. But I would say that, yes, there is a place, and I'm probably yet to get to those hard questions, but certainly possibilities, sure.
A question on Freud. That Freud is seen as a misogynist, but there is a way in which he's contributed to feminist thinking. He claimed that at the subconscious level, women never accept the cultural definition of femininity. So what's your view on Freud and feminism?
To be honest, I haven't done a lot of reading, but I know that a lot of scholars, such as Cathy Carew in the United States, has done a huge amount of work in this area. And I think she's written a lot on Anna Freud. So that would be my go-to to be able to answer this question more intelligently. And I'm sorry that I can't, but I think that there are many contemporary feminist scholars who would be able to, whose work addresses this in a way that I haven't got to just yet.
So the next question from Ankara. Do you think that writers turn to the psychoanalytical predominantly to explain perceived difference from an imagined norm? So, explicating genius or reading repressed sexuality? And if so, is this a strength or a weakness? Do we need to see a psychobiography of a healthy, happy, well-adjusted musician with positive and enduring relationships? It sounds boring, doesn't it?
I know. And Harrod, where did you get this question? Oh, these are terrific questions. I think some psychoanalytical works are undertaken to explain a perceived difference. Usually that difference is a difference of greatness. It can also be a difference of perversion, perhaps. Certainly imagined, yes. Could be a strength, could be a weakness. And do we need to see a psychobiography of a healthy, happy, well-adjusted musician with positive and enduring relationships? Absolutely. And yes, I think such an undertaking would be the test of the biographical limits of psychoanalysis. Absolutely. That's a terrific question. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just trying to think if there is one.
I'm just going to ask who would you nominate for this through this subject, the healthy, happy, well-adjusted musician?
Well, I'm thinking. I don't.
If anyone has a suggestion, you're the happiest, healthiest, most emotionally well-adjusted musician, please type it in the chat function or the Q&A, because
there has been some good work on Debussy and Mahler, actually. And there's an article on Madonna, one of Madonna's hits as well. That could fit this category. Yeah.
So a question now from the HSE's friend Paul McGee. I note the 20th century biographical accounts of Verdi invariably mention his childhood witnessing of an attack upon his village and the impact of the horror of that on his operas. Freud is not necessarily mentioned at all, but that sort of account seems to betray the influence of his categories. So what about the psychobiographical that is not explicitly labeled as such? How separable is it from what we know of as 20th and 21st century biography?
Yeah, hi Paul. I didn't know that about Verdi actually. So first of all, thanks for pointing that out. I have seen in a lot of writing different paths taken and different theories proposed in reading trauma, and that being separate to a psycho-historical or a psychobiographical account. So off the top of my head, it would seem that maybe Freud's work wasn't invoked, but maybe other theorists of trauma are used. And maybe it's theories of trauma rather than psychohistory or psychoanalytic studies per se that is the way in here. And yes, some scholars have separated, Freudian theory from trauma. There was others that would argue that they're enmeshed. So they are separable, but maybe they aren't, depending, I think, on whose work is, whose theories are being utilised.
So I'm afraid we've run out of time. So thank you, Paul, and thank you for all the questions and the participants as well. Just to let you know, we have 2 upcoming events in the HSE later this month. On the 22nd of October, which is a Friday, in our Books That Changed Humanity series, we welcome Meredith Rosner, who's a criminologist here at the ANU, discussing Irving Goffman's The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, which is an important book in the social sciences. And then the following week, so that's on a Friday, the 22nd of October, the following week on Thursday, the 28th of October, we welcome Rachel Ann Kenny, who's a philosopher from the University of Adelaide, the same as Paul, discussing the development of the concept of the model organism in biology. So that's in the natural sciences, and that's part of our Works That Shape the World series. So thank you again, Paul. Thank you, all the participants, and we hope to see you again at one of our HRC events later in the month.
Thanks very much, everyone.